Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you all are. My name is Nitya Chanana, and I'm from the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I welcome you all to the webinar on small and electric, the international case to move away from combustion SUVs. And quickly, before we really get into the webinar, I would just like to mention a few housekeeping points. The webinar is going to be recorded, and this recording is going to be available on the UC Davis website by early next week. And for all those who are attending this webinar, we will also be sending out an email to let you know that the recording is available. The questions will be taken using the Q&A feature that you can all see in the lower tab of the Zoom application. And any tech questions or any other questions that you would like to ask, please also feel free to type that in the chat. There's also closed captioning available if you would like to use it. Okay, so we'll begin with the webinar. Just to give you all a brief background, this webinar is basically a follow-up on the report that was jointly launched by the University of California, Davis Europe Transportation Center, as well as the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, supported by FIA Foundation last week. The report has already been covered by 25 stories and has had a pretty impressive reach across different regions. And this webinar will primarily explore the shift towards cleaner technologies and how small EVs can be a part of the solution, and enabling addressing of economic and supply chain challenges while delivering environmental safety and strategic benefits. This webinar has two key speakers, Jacob Teter and Pierpaolo Cazzola from the UC Davis Institute of Transportation, as well as two key discussants, Alex Koerner, who's the team lead of electric mobility at UNEP, and Sheila Watson, who's the deputy director of the FIA Foundation and also the executive secretary to the GFEI. So I would give the floor now to Pierpaolo Cazzola, who will be starting with the presentation. Over to you, Pierre.
Thanks so much, Nitya, and hi everyone. Great to be doing this. I'll begin to walk you through and then hand over to Jacob and pick up towards the end. So I'll start with this, which is an introduction slide. So in showing the working paper, which is what we are presenting today, and giving some key introductory considerations. So we wrote this because the automotive industry is in a pivotal moment with several pressures in terms of industrial, environmental, and geopolitical terms. And we also wrote this in the wake of other work that was done by GFEI and by the Institute of Transportation Studies, calling for greater consideration for smaller electric vehicles and more affordable ones. So we make a case in this report. We show basically why smaller electric vehicle can be part of the solution, and they can help address economic and supply chain challenges, but also delivering environmental road safety and strategic benefits in terms of industrial competitiveness. And based on this, we argue that they will be a strategic necessity. They can, in order to help us moving forward on the achievement of different policy goals. The first, let's say, content-related slide is this one, which shows two graphics. One is on the market evolution, automotive market evolution, the car market evolution in different regions, global regions. So this leverages a lot of historical data from GFEI and updates them up to 2024. 2025 will not show radical changes compared to this. In essence, there is an evolution in the car market that has been seeing significant growth from the 2010s to today of the Chinese car market, which China now accounting for about 27-28% of global car sales and being the largest market globally. if taken as a single entity. And while let's say the Western markets have been somewhat stagnating compared to what we saw where they were in the early 2000s. So Western market meaning North America, Europe, and Japan, Korea. There is another big evolution which is related with electrification, which is shown on the bottom graph. So same overall data, but not shown by country, but this time by powertrain, differentiating between battery electric, PHEVs, so public plug-in hybrids, and internal combustion engine vehicles. And there, what is visible is essentially the stagnation of the market size of the internal combustion engine vehicles globally, with growth represented by new powertrains or emerging powertrains, essentially in particular battery electric vehicles or electrified vehicles more broadly. There is another trend that we talk about in the report, which is the development towards vehicles that have gained weight and size. So it became larger and heavier. So what you see here is the market development, where in red you have SUVs, larger and more SUVs, pickup trucks are shown with the larger SUVs. And then in green, the traditional cars, small, medium, and large, so sedan, but also hatchbacks. And what you see here is that at the global scale, there has been a development towards an increased share of large vehicles. This comes with safety challenges and challenges related with resource demand, energy, and materials. Jacob will explore more on these, so I'll skip quickly through these points. And at the same time, while this happened, China has evolved significantly. So the figure on the right shows exports, net export production, and capacity factors of Chinese auto production. And in particular, there is this massive change in trend happening right after COVID, with Chinese car export growing significantly, enabling China to become the main car exporter globally in absolute and in net terms. Production has also grown and capacity factor remain low, meaning that there is potential for more production. The Chinese market has also been the one that has been adopting EVs more than any major, let's say, other single country such as Norway have exceeded Chinese market shares when it comes to battery electric vehicles, but Norway is part of the broader European market, and if taken together, Europe has not kept the pace of the transition to electric vehicles that we have observed in China. 2025 shows growth in the European market, but continued leadership in terms of market share for China, and less stagnation in the US, and the dynamic developments in emerging economies, which is interesting. And so things are evolving, and China has been ahead in terms of electrification. And the competitive edge of China in terms of electrification is not limited to the market share of the vehicles. It's also related with the battery supply chain. So this graphic is from the IEA Critical Minerals report released earlier this year. Both Jacob and I spent some time at the IEA, and so we share the view that the evolution that we see has been a significant success from a Chinese perspective, but it's also a significant challenge for other economies, because it points towards strong dependence, potentially over-dependence on Chinese supplies when it comes to batteries, cell components, and cell materials needed for the production of EV batteries. So the point we're making here is that it's going to be Chinese success has been a key feature of what has happened so far, and it's going to be important to consider this seriously, also from responding to it in terms of diversifying industrial developments. So we think small EVs can also help with that, and that's a key point that we want to make with this report. I'll hand it over to Jacob to talk about energy materials, road safety impacts, and other considerations that we cover in the report.
Thanks, Pierre. And before I jump into the main advantages of small battery electric cars, I'd like to encourage everyone attending to feel free to type in any questions you might have as we're speaking, whether they be clarification questions or kind of deeper dives on the content. And we look forward to addressing those questions in the second half of the session. The report that we've authored outlines the main benefits of small battery electric cars across 4 axes: economic and environmental, societal, and strategic. And starting with the energy and resource efficiency benefits. First, bigger, heavier cars obviously use more energy. This effect is strongest in gasoline-powered conventional ICE cars. It's weaker in hybrids due to regenerative braking, and it's weakest in BEVs due to the efficiency of electric motors, but it's always there in each powertrain technology. Second, larger BEVs tend to be equipped with much bigger batteries, often 70 to 100 kilowatt hours, as compared with 30 to 50 kilowatt hours for small cars. And these bigger batteries mean more weight, more cost, and more demand for critical minerals. So small BEVs are the most efficient choice. They use much less energy per kilometer than cars running on liquid fuels. They also use less electricity and fewer minerals than big BEVs, which means that they offer more mobility for the same amount of resources and energy. Next slide, please. Second, smaller, lighter vehicles are also safer than big, heavy ones, at least for everyone else besides the people driving the big cars. There's a very rich academic literature that digs into and quantifies this rather intuitive conclusion. It draws on empirical data based on statistics of vehicle usage and on the physics of collisions. And this literature documents how likely and how severe collisions are for both vehicle occupants and for others like pedestrians and cyclists. So for example, the figures shown here highlight the findings of a recent study of cars operating on Belgian roads. The figure on the left shows that being an occupant in a heavy car actually somewhat reduces the risk of injury or death once a collision occurs. It doesn't say anything about the likelihood of collision. For that, you would need more detailed statistics on like the vehicle kilometers by vehicle category. But it shows that if you're hit by a car that is heavier or more powerful than the average car, then the likelihood of serious injuries or death both increase markedly. The figure on the right shows the increase in the chances of serious injury or death for so-called vulnerable users. These are people that aren't in a car, all the other potential users of a road. And if they get hit by heavier cars, then the risk of death increases. Also, the risk of death would increase if they're hit by cars with higher hood heights, which is a typical design characteristic of course, of SUVs. So while the severity and probability of injuries and death differ across different geographies, depending on specificities of vehicle design or size or weight, as well as how the cars are used, the general pattern of increased risk and severity in the case of collisions across vehicle size, weight, power, and hood height remains. Next slide. So then the question might be raised about what's behind the increase in SUV sales, which is, as Pierpaolo showed, a common feature across all regional car markets. And the answer you commonly get is that consumers are just increasingly demanding bigger cars, and that this creep to larger and heavier vehicles just reflects car buyers' preferences. And while that may be true, may or may not be true, especially for wealthier segments of the population that buy cars new, what is clear is that car makers do make greater margins on heavier cars, and that they tend to spend quite a bit more on advertising in the larger segments. However, as cars have gotten more expensive, consumers have tended to hold on to them longer. As a growing share of potential car buyers find themselves priced out of the market, they find that new cars on offer tend to be too expensive. And a similar dynamic is at play in the used vehicle market. This has led to an increase in the average age at which vehicles are deregistered, as shown on the left-hand side figure, and the average age of cars on the road, as shown in the right-hand side figure, both across European countries. And this, some of the countries with the best, most transparent, most reliable data. So as more people have been priced out of car ownership, the overall size of the car market across all Western markets, not just in the European Union, has shrunk. Next, staying on this slide, turning to EVs. Sorry, Pierre. EVs are also generally more expensive to buy than ICE cars, though this isn't always the case. For instance, small battery electric cars cost less in China than their conventional equivalents. But in most cases, the higher efficiency of electric cars makes them cheaper to charge and to drive on a dollars per kilometer metric than fueling on a conventional car on gasoline or diesel. Nevertheless, the gap in this purchase price between conventional cars and battery electric cars remains a challenge, especially in the global south, as evidenced. But that gap is closing, as evidenced by countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Colombia, Indonesia, and Brazil, where battery electric car sales shares have risen dramatically just over the past couple of years, and especially the last year, for which we have full data. Next slide. It's always important to acknowledge the fact that the transition to EVs is occurring in a complicated and challenging geopolitical context, with China's primacy in EV battery supply chains and with EV production overcapacity and battery production overcapacity leading to fierce domestic price competition in China. There's a growing concern in Europe and North America about the risks associated with over-reliance on China for EV batteries, as well as how and whether domestic car makers in Europe or North America can continue to compete with increasingly high quality and low price Chinese battery electric vehicles, and for that matter, also plug-in hybrids and conventional cars. These are all very big and broad topics, and we can get into them further in our discussion. But I wanted to highlight here one point that's much often less pointed out in kind of the media and in international dialogue, and was first highlighted in a 2023 report by the International Transport Forum and by one of our study's co-authors, Matteo Creglia. And that is the potential for used car exports from China to really explode over the coming decade or so, and to surpass the used vehicle exports from other major regional car markets. So as Pierre showed already in the opening slides, China has already surpassed in 2023 Japan and Germany as the world's leading car exporter. This is of new cars. And as China transitions to EVs, many older used conventional cars may be exported, and those volumes, the potential for those volumes to grow is enormous. Final slide that I'll cover before handing back off to Pierpaolo. Go ahead, Pierre. And this just summarizes the four axes on which we've tried to lay out the benefits of smaller EVs. First, on the affordability front, smaller EVs with smaller batteries, again, they're more affordable to a broader swath of consumers. As battery costs continue to decline, arguably smaller, more affordable EVs may have the best prospects for achieving purchase price parity with comparable ICE cars. A shift in focus from greater margins per vehicle to increasing the volume of cars sold is a strategy that also has the potential to reverse the trend in declining car sales in markets like Europe and the US. On the energy security front, a shift from ICE cars to smaller EVs can help oil importing countries to reduce their exposure to volatile oil prices. Small EVs can provide the greatest mobility opportunities per unit battery capacity and reduce the exposure to critical mineral availability and price volatility. And as Alex might want to touch upon in his comments, electric 2- and 3-wheelers are potentially an even better option in many contexts than small battery electric cars. Then the environmental case for smaller EVs is quite clear and mostly follows from their lower energy and resource or material intensity versus both internal combustion engine cars and larger EVs. But there's also the fact that a shift to smaller, cheaper EVs would likely lead to faster fleet turnover, which has big implications for the potential speed of the transition to electric vehicles and more sustainable road transport. And then finally, in the face of competition with China, higher production, higher sales volumes of smaller EVs could help Western OEMs to unlock economies of scale, helping them to compete not only in their home markets, but also in the current and future growth markets of emerging economies like those in Latin and South America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Asia. I'll now hand the floor back to Pierre to outline the policies that we propose to steer car markets towards smaller EVs.
Thank you, Jacob. Sub-Saharan Africa, not Asia, but just a small point on what you were concluding. So in the we included policy recommendations in the report. There are two sets of recommendations. One is on how to stimulate the market shift from larger and heavy ICE EVs towards smaller EVs. So it's a combination of transitioning the technology towards battery electric and also transitioning the size downwards. It doesn't mean we're advocating only for mini EVs. We are advocating for reversing the growth that we are seeing across the markets towards larger vehicles with the arguments that Jacob just described in this summary slide. Instruments that we refer to include differentiated taxation based on environmental performance and also considering vehicle weight as a way to define the taxation structure. We talk about regulations and incentives in targeting high utilization vehicles to increase market scale. We also talk about capital recovery guarantees to reduce financial risks. This is particularly important also beyond the car market, into the truck market. There's another report that was released recently, authored by Matteo, who's one of our co-authors precisely on that. We argue for stricter CO2 and energy efficiency standards for larger and heavier vehicles, although also about the fact that they shouldn't leave the transition for smaller vehicle out of the game. This was potentially one of the issues with the European policy structure that ultimately exacerbated the problem of cornering Western European car makers towards the premium markets rather than trying to seek the transition across the board. This is important now as regulatory requirements overall are increasing in terms of increasing the need for market share of battery electric vehicles. We also refer to specific regulations related to battery capacities and their size. We went actually deeper into all these topics in earlier GFEI reports, so we refer also to that. Regarding this, there's more detail there. We also mentioned the importance of policies targeting used vehicle markets. So differentiated taxation is not just about new car sales. It can also be about shaping used imports. Maybe Alex will tell us more about this, as he has extensive experience working with emerging economies. There are also recommendations related with charging infrastructure. The deployment of chargers, affordable charger, is actually important also for equity reasons, and equity reasons link with the argument that the focus on EVs should shift away from premium markets into more diversity, including smaller EVs. And then we mentioned the importance also of energy and financing policies, such as low carbon electricity generation, which helps reducing the cost of electricity, and funding for infrastructure in emerging economies, because this is something that results in greater EV cost competitiveness and hence greater market share and eases access across greater segments of society. Then we have specific recommendations regarding the risk of over-dependencies that we discussed and the fact that China has been pressing ahead while, driving a gap between its capacity to supply EVs to the globally and what is actually happening in Western markets. And what Western manufacturers can do. So regarding this, we refer to policy support in R&D, manufacturing efficiency. A lot of the idea of scaling up means also lower unit costs, so better manufacturing efficiency, recycling technologies, and reducing reliance on primary critical minerals. So this is important. There are already policies developed in the EU, but not in other parts of the world. This can be a challenge if EVs are traded internationally and needs to be addressed. Again, this is probably a topic that Alex can build on. And we refer to the relevance of investment incentives tied to environmental safety, social and supply chain transparency standards, which can be a way to help diversify the market without only looking at premium market segments, but on other logics. Then conditional regulation and incentives, such as life cycle carbon metrics, recycled materials, and battery repairability. These, again, can help diversify supply in the battery supply chain. We refer to joint ventures and licensing deals, basically acknowledging the fact that we understand that there's a competitiveness aspect and the scale aspect that has brought China ahead, and then cooperation with China on these to bridge the challenges that that come from that is important. We have seen this type of development in the past. It was more between, let's say, North American and Japanese manufacturers. So this time is different, but that the joint ventures and licensing these were part of how that was addressed. We also refer to trade measures, temporary trade measures, because the idea is to cover, let's say, help bridge the issues in terms of competitiveness that we don't intend to leave there forever. So the idea of these complementary policies is indeed to try to narrow that gap. And we see smaller high volumes EVs as part of what can be supported by these. For example, the share of transport costs for a smaller EV is higher than it is for a premium market EV. So there are structural aspects that can help there. And then also we mentioned the importance, and this is a very complex space in policymaking, of secure and responsible sourcing of critical raw material, increasing diversification of battery supply chains. Without increased demand of EVs, there's no increased demand of cells. Without diversification of cell production, there's no increased demand of cell material production. And so this trickles down. It's important to trigger a development that can help structurally diversify supply chains. So that's also something we touch upon. And I close here with one slide that essentially says that we see many reasons for policymakers to embrace more, in a way that is bolder, the transition towards smaller EVs as part of what will continue to shape the automotive market. We see reasons grounded on improved vehicle affordability, accelerations of electric mobility, so strategic relevance for industrial competitiveness, lower energy demand, lower pollutant emissions, better opportunities to manage critical minerals demand, accelerated turnover, mentioned earlier from Jacob, that also comes with environmental advantages, enhanced road safety. Again, Jacob did a great job sketching out what we try to highlight in the report, and overall essentially helping also with the geopolitical challenges and competitiveness related challenges that risk to exacerbate the industrialization trends in parts of the world. So we define, let's say, we use this headline of EVs being not just a practical solution, but also a strategic necessity. And so I want to stress it here. We are convinced that this is the case, and we think it's time for policy to evolve towards acknowledging this and taking action in order to achieve progress. Voila, here is our emails if you want to reach out directly, but we'll move to the Q&A. I'll hand it over to Nitya for responses from Alex and Sheila, and then discussion. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much, Pierpaolo and Jacob. And I know we have the next part of the session, which is taking comments from Alexander and Sheila. But before we move on to that, I saw that we already have two questions, and since that's very closely linked to the presentation that you just gave, it might be good to just take these questions right now. Jacob, I will ask you to please answer the first question on Francis's bonus malus as a good example to follow. And then maybe, Pierpaolo, you could answer the other question on what is the likelihood of EU policies to include weight, which is based on an article that Matthias Goldman shared from Forbes. So I'll hand it over to you, Jacob, to just answer that first question.
Thanks, Matthias. Well, I mean, I would say the Francis bonus malus, to my mind, is an example of an excellent policy. It has done a fantastic job in keeping France's new vehicle registrations among the most efficient on a sales weighted basis in terms of grams of CO2 per kilometer rated emissions among all EU countries. I don't think that it's a sufficient policy mechanism. You could argue that automakers, since they have to meet the CO2 standards at an EU-wide level, have sold potentially more heavier, more emitting cars outside of France, and that there's been some kind of leakage of the policy. You could also argue, I think much more justifiably, that by making the performance metric simply the tailpipe emissions, this policy hasn't necessarily incentivized the sales and production of small EVs to the extent that other policy mechanisms could. You can still get quite a big bonus just by selling a battery electric vehicle, regardless of its size. And maybe that's a good segue to Pierpaolo, who will take your second question on the likelihood of EU policies that include weight either explicitly or, as some of the policies that Pierpaolo already mentioned, kind of implicitly, if not directly, have some kind of aspect of weight or vehicle materials in their design.
Okay, no, thanks. So first, what I want to say is that my understanding is that some of the EU policies already do include weight-related consideration, maybe not sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. There are, for example, some European countries that have caps on what can, which kind of models can enjoy tax advantages based on essentially limiting the price level beyond and forbidding advantages or tax rebates to be available for the most expensive models. This is in a way something that implicitly induces or like let's say funnels the power of differentiated taxation towards the smaller vehicles. This is not the case everywhere, and I think should be taken more broadly into consideration. That could also be that sort of funneling of the power of differentiated taxation towards smaller vehicles can also be done at the member state level with weight becoming one of the parameters based on which the enabling or not access to rebates is possible. And then there are also other considerations. Weight in a way is already accounted for in the CO2 regulations in the EU. The way this is distributed depends across different vehicle models, depends on weight. The slope of how tight this should be for different type of vehicles across different weights, it's something that can influence whether or not the response needs to be focusing on bringing more EVs into the smaller vehicle segments rather than the larger vehicle segments. So that's something, I mean, to some extent, the European policy has already evolved there, but there is room for further improvement. So these are just a couple of examples on how, to some extent, this is already considered and more can be done at the same time. I'll hand over back to Nitya for getting Alex and Sheila in the game.
Thank you, Pierre. And I see a lot of other questions coming in, but we'll take that after we have comments from Alex and Sheila. And for those of you who joined late, we are now into the next phase of the webinar, which is basically interacting with Alexander Koerner from UNEP and Sheila Watson from the PIA Foundation and getting their comments on the discussion here. So let me start with you, Sheila. It would be great if we could have your views on the small and electric report and how you feel it fits with the overall GFEI objectives.
Hi, thanks, Nitya, for that question. Well, I mean, it fits perfectly, would be my immediate answer, but to say a little more about why. So the FIA Foundation, who many of you may not know, is a UK-based charity with objectives around safe, clean, fair and green mobility. As part of those objectives, we've been a key partner in the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, set up now many years ago, partners including UC Davis, who are here today, UNEP, who are here today, but also the International Energy Agency, the International Transport Forum, and the International Council on Clean Transportation. So very much, if I may dare say it, and excluding ourselves, the brains trust when it comes to considering how we regulate and support this global transition to cleaner mobility, in particular to cleaner vehicles. That project, the GFEI, operates in three ways. We support countries as they look at the transition and consider the options from regulation in different forms, for example. We advocate globally for change and for a focus on the concept of efficiency and how important it is that we make this transition swiftly and effectively. But we also do a great deal of research work, and that's where this report fits into that, expanding our understanding of trends in the global vehicle market, in particular tracking fuel efficiency improvements, but also exposing changes such as this change, which has been the ever-growing size of internal combustion engine vehicles. And I make that point particularly because one of the reasons I think that we felt so keen at the foundation to support these projects around SUVs is because there is something, I think, of a false argument being deployed in places that weight is a phenomenon of electrification and size is a phenomenon of electrification, which it simply is not. It is a phenomenon which has been within our internal combustion fleet for many years now. In fact, a recent study, which we also supported by T&E, identified that bonnet height has increased, I think, by 0.5 centimetre or a centimetre every year for 15 years. That bonnet height means that now some of these biggest SUVs can't see a 9-year-old child stood right in front of them. So when you go back to the Foundation's objectives, which is a concern about road safety and how those not only in the vehicles, but indeed outside of the vehicles fare in any form of collision, then you can quickly see that for us, SUVs which are growing at that rate and which could have such a terrible impact on the human body if they hit it, a child they hit right in the head, an adult they hit in the internal organs and drag, much more likely to drag you underneath the vehicle, then for that reason, we don't like the look of these vehicles, but also very importantly for the environmental impact, the resource use. It's been described very, very well by the report's authors, but the T&E report said that if all the SUVs in the world were added together, they would count as the 5th most polluting country on the planet. This is a huge phenomenon globally, and as we all know, these vehicles never exist just once. They get exported and traded, and so they don't go away very quickly. So we have to be acting very swiftly now, I think, to be addressing the issue of ever-growing vehicle size. So yes, the report fits extremely well within the objectives of the Global Fuel Economy Initiative because it shows that as we move towards electrification, size does really matter. It's a trend which must be reversed. It cannot just continue on as we are at the moment.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for that. That was really powerful. We'll move on to Alex Koerner from UNEP. And Alex, it would be good to get a perspective of someone who's been working a lot on emerging economies and what your thoughts are on the overall report and the presentation today.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the very good presentation. Maybe a little bit of context what qualifies me to sit here in that meeting. So first of all, UNEP is a long-standing partner of GFI. That is, of course, a qualification. And secondly, we are managing, I would say, in terms of countries, the biggest electric mobility program in the Global South. At this moment in time, we are implementing about 57, we are implementing e-mobility projects in about 57 Global South countries, meaning Latin America, meaning Africa, meaning Southeast Asia. And that's mostly grant funding. It's about $170 million going into mostly policy development. Now we are doing this together with partners, and funding is mostly coming from institutions like the GEF, mechanisms like ICI, the German initiative, but then of course foundations also such as FIA Foundation, and we are very grateful for this. So the main target of that work is actually making countries in the Global South ready to adopt electric vehicles. And yes, there's a very big policy perspective, but there's also we're also implementing pilots, and we are just recently focusing quite a bit into the aspect of used electric vehicles, battery end of life, and circularity. Now, why does this report fit so well? Maybe a couple of overarching messages. I mean, that's a number which has been cited very often, but we're going from about 1.2 billion to 2.5 billion light-duty vehicles being on the road between, let's say, now and 2050. We are talking about doubling of the global fleet of light-duty vehicles, and basically all that growth is taking place in non-OECD countries. Now, of course, non-OECD countries includes very big countries and very big drivers like China, which I wouldn't qualify a Global South country in terms of electric mobility, but then also India, and then of course entire African continent, many Southeast Asian countries with a lot of population. And these being markets which are actually purchase power constrained. So I would say if I was a car manufacturer and if I would target these markets, then it looks like a pretty smart idea to have small electric vehicles if you want to sell a lot of those in markets where people need to think how to spend the US dollar or whatever other currency. So yes, I think from that end, it seems to be actually quite logical to think about the uptake of small and affordable electric vehicles, given the fact that most of the vehicle market growth will be in markets which are purchase power constrained. And therefore, if manufacturers want to be part of that or want to make a profit in these markets, they should provide the right offer. So I think that is sort of a simple truth, I would say. With regards to all the other sort of conclusions or recommendations which have been drawn here, I mean, just a couple of comments. Of course, China will play a major role in the electrification of Global South, because for the time being, I believe they are amongst those which have the best offer. Why do they have the best offer? Global South is very much looking into fleet vehicles. This is where really the biggest growth market is. Fleet vehicles meaning electric motorcycles for passenger transport, playing a pretty big role in Africa. I mean, we just did a couple of calculations saying that maybe 30% of the fuel use in African countries is actually used by motorcycles. That is somewhat flying under the radar with much global North policymakers, but indeed on the African continent, the motorcycle is a very important fuel user and a very important socioeconomic element, because of a lot of young people are actually earning their life with driving passengers on the backseat of a motorcycle. Now fleet vehicles, electric motorcycles, very big topic. Other big topic is buses, be that small buses, be that medium-sized buses. Actually, not so much the very big buses. Yes, there are a lot of cities which are considering bus rapid transit systems as sort of the affordable metro or whatever you want to call it. But then a big BRT system maybe needs like 200, 300 buses. mostly deployed in capitals. There's only so many capitals around the world. Actually, I think, again, the very big market lies with medium-sized buses, which, again, don't play such a big role in the global north, like 30-seaters, 35-seaters, 8-meter-long buses, not so much the 12-meter-long buses. And again, actually, we are with small electric vehicles, but now in the bus segment. Again, I believe a growth market where many of the let's say European manufacturers don't have much to offer, I would argue. Last mile delivery, three-wheelers, these sort of things, again, fleet vehicles playing a huge role. And then, of course, also the impact of ride hailing. I'm not sure that's the right sort of the right term anymore, but if we talk about the Ubers and the Bolts and whatever companies offering these taxi services, that's a huge market, and these are small vehicles. I mean, and look at I'm looking at the market in Kenya, living in Kenya since 8 years. A typical Uber vehicle would be a Maruti Alto or Suzuki Alto, very small vehicle. Now, electrifying these vehicles and offering them at a competitive price, I think that's really a very big market, which should not be left out, and which sort of supports all the other conclusions which were presented in the report on scaling up battery production, on the interplay with charging infrastructure, all these sort of things. I think that's actually all, very well lined out, and I think it fits very well in what we are saying. Last but not least, I mean, me working for United Nations Environment Program, but then very often environment isn't actually the major driver, maybe apart from air pollution, for global South countries to adopt electric mobility. It's very much about adding local value chains to countries, like through assembly, through manufacturing, through locating a part of the vehicle value chain in the country. And here again, I think the smaller vehicle segment would be much more adequate to actually do that sort of job. And of course, this displays into what has already been said in the report, that of course, a lot of global South countries are looking into reducing fuel imports, reducing let's say, pressure on foreign exchange balances, create local jobs. And again, all this in markets where smaller vehicles are needed. So I think that report gives a good hint to car manufacturers to actually try to serve that market.
Great. Thank you so much for those insightful points, Alex. That was really interesting. Thank you to all the speakers and the discussants. We will now move to the final phase of the webinar, which is taking in Q&A. We have a couple of questions already. Let me start by asking the first one by Pedro Gomez. His question is, the EC is studying an intermediate vehicle category between quadricycles L5 to L7 and passenger cars M1, N1, smaller and more fit for cities. Do you see this as a viable option for example, urban and rural mobility? And I'll open the floor to the panelists to answer the question. Pierre, would you like to take this?
Okay, I'll take a quick stab at this. I think this is an interesting space. The L5, L7 come with regulatory simplification, basically. They have been seized by some manufacturers because of that. They have enabled some deployment, which was very quick. And they're also seen as something that doesn't overlap with the main car market. So that was the attractiveness. My understanding is trying to develop something that is an M0, N0 is somewhat similar to leaving the interest for that without giving in on the safety requirements that those vehicles should have, because ultimately they're used like cars and they are mini cars. So in that respect, I think this is a positive development. I do think protecting safety makes sense. We are in a space anyway where we need shorter times to market, especially for the smaller vehicles. And so I see this positively. Need to be seen how that will actually materialize.
Thank you, Pierre. Moving on to the next question by Matt. How much of efficiency policy is dependent on external conditions, such as the deployment of significant rapid charger networks or with efficient vehicles having extremely FADA changing capabilities? Would you like to take that as well, Pierre?
Okay, maybe I also quickly try to take this. I would say I would look at efficiency in a broad sense. Let's say slow charging or charging that doesn't depend on high capacity charging is generally paired with a better response to the needs of the electricity system alongside the transport, the e-mobility system. And also generally comes with lower costs. The challenge of that is ensuring equitable access to chargers. So I personally see the role of rapid charging and publicly accessible charging more relevant for equity considerations for people that cannot access to their own private chargers or workplace chargers, rather than something that has to do with efficiency. In my opinion, the efficiency, energy efficiency, and system integration is more interesting if it's focused, like if it's paired with, let's say, conventional charging, not fast charging.
Great, thank you for that. Moving on to the next question. Has China achieved higher electrification in small, medium cars than large cars? And if yes, do you think China's auto export potential can address this shift to larger cars globally? I'll let Jacob answer that.
Thanks. Yeah, so the latest data we have on the segmentation of electric vehicle sales in China is already somewhat dated. I put the link in the chat to everyone of our previous global summary report, where there are a couple figures, and in particular figure 17 that shows the distribution of EV sales across different car segments. The car sales in China are typically talked about, electric car sales in China are typically talked about as a dumbbell pattern, where there's a disproportionate amount of electric vehicle sales in the small segment and in the large and SUV segment. That's starting to fill in the middle as well, but indeed, there's a very high sales share in China of small EV car sales. And indeed, as Alex already highlighted, this is a market that is likely to grow in a lot of global South countries. And unless Western OEMs start to up their offer there, then China does have significant potential to cater to that market. And that's a big growth market.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is by Jules. She says, thanks so much for unpacking these insightful policy recommendations. According to you, what would be the most relevant policy instrument to make sure that small, locally made, high-volume EVs remain competitive against cheap Chinese EV imports, bearing in mind current loopholes like zero-mileage used car imports from China circumventing tariffs? Would you suggest a different trade policy than, for example, the current one in force in the EU?
Okay, maybe I can say a couple of words on some aspects of this. I think what matters a lot is demand. So we want to mobilize demand for small EVs in the European market. Some policies have already tried to do that. The French social leasing, which lasted very little in time and potentially could be picked up again with the Social Climate Fund, the resources from the Social Climate Fund, so the ETS2, could be one way to do that, especially if it's paired with other characteristics that funnel those resources towards manufacturing that is happening in directly or indirectly, let's say, funnel those resources to manufacturing that is happening in the EU. Using European wealth, let's say, to promote European manufacturing makes sense. European manufacturing has the advantage of being less carbon intensive than manufacturing in other parts of the world because of the lower carbon intensity of the European economy. I think it makes sense to try to leverage that. And so the combination of these is something that could help achieve what Jules is referring to in his question, I think.
Thank you. We have another question by Pedro. Given the constraints in charging infrastructure and grid distribution, should we consider solutions such as battery swapping, especially for fleets? It will also help reduce upfront costs, given that battery is a big chunk of the EV cost.
Alex,
Jacob?
do you wanna? Yeah, well, I think
Sure, I think that's a very good question. And just to say that battery swapping is already taking place, but maybe not in the vehicle segment you're targeting, because I'm not talking about cars, but motorcycles and three-wheelers. So what we're currently seeing is that basically most of the motorcycle operations, which require actually high power and high range, which is, for example, the sort of taxi service on the African continent, that they are almost exclusively working on battery swap systems. Yeah. Now, of course, in a motorcycle, let's say, the way such a battery is integrated into the vehicle doesn't completely determine sort of the looks and feels and whatnot of a vehicle. And I would say that is probably the biggest barrier to, let's say, transform battery swapping into other vehicle segments, such as light-duty vehicles. I mean, to make a light-duty vehicle battery swappable, first of all, the light-duty vehicle would probably look not like most consumers want to buy it. And then also I would this would require a level of uniformity among cars and car manufacturers and whatnot, which probably the market also doesn't want. Yeah? But funny enough, I heard in another meeting that Japan is considering the battery swapping for medium freight trucks. And now this again seems to be something which is relatively interesting, or maybe even more interesting. Huh? I mean, medium freight trucks being sort of a simple vehicle, I would say battery swapping, maybe as a side note, the more integrated the vehicle, the less likely it is suitable for swapping. Integrated, I mean like a full chassis and whatnot, a modern vehicle. Medium freight truck, basically a frame with axles, a drivetrain in the front, electric drivetrain maybe somewhere else on the hubs, but then a box or whatever flatbed on the back and the driver cabin in the front. I mean, seems a pretty simple vehicle. Now, applying battery swapping to these sort of vehicles could be very interesting. Yeah. Now, if Japan is pursuing that technology, then quite honestly, that can have a lot of impact on a continent like the African one, because most of these medium freight trucks, which play a huge role here, because the moment you go off tarmac, you don't need a truck to trailer combination because it won't go anywhere. But that's all rigid, whatever, 20-tonner vehicles, medium freight trucks. There might be an opportunity for electrification in the freight sector, and then actually also combining this with battery swapping.
Great. Thank you for that, Alex. And I know we're already at the hour, but there's just two more questions that we would like to take before we conclude the webinar. And thank you so much for the great responses. We're really excited to see the interaction that we're having here. The next question is by Sarah. She asks, can you share your perspective on whether policymakers should consider capping EV battery size, or if such limits might risk discouraging innovation and make EVs less practical for long distance travel?
I'll take a stab at that very quickly. Thanks, Sarah, for your question. I think an outright cap is not something we would recommend, but there are other policy instruments that could be considered to try to incentivize more efficient EVs at the vehicle level, rather than trying to look at the battery capacity as a performance metric per se. China, for instance, has proposed fuel efficiency standards, energy intensity standards that take into account also the efficiency of electric vehicles, and past subsidy schemes in China have taken into account the energy efficiency of electric vehicles to try to incentivize more efficient EVs. At the same time, they've actually incentivized EVs based on their battery capacity and all electric range. We do discuss in the report other policy instruments that do take into account total battery capacity, but we are well aware of the exact risk that you're pointing out, that we don't want to discourage innovation or recommend other policy instruments that might have unintended consequences. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Maybe just one small addition: corporate average standards, similar to what is done for fuel economy, could be applicable to battery size, and leaving freedom to decide where to allocate larger batteries, where to allocate smaller ones. So without stifling innovation, but still providing a policy signal that's the direction of travel.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for that. We'll just take one final question, which is asking, in your views, how relevant can bidirectionality / V2G be in the future? And can it have a stronger role in smaller vehicles than bigger ones? Who would like to answer that? Okay, Pierre.
I'll try. I mentioned before the importance of slow charging, let's say, or conventional charging, because it's a better way to respond, to help ensuring that EVs become an asset for the electric system rather than a liability. In a way, so that essentially that idea could be based on solutions like delayed charging. It's already something that provides a lot of advantages. V2G and bidirectionality is something that goes beyond that and enable increased flexibility. I find is interesting, but I must say I think there's a lot that can already be achieved with charging flexibility and delayed charging features. As small EVs have smaller batteries, it's possible that it'll actually, but it depends on the kind of usage profile per day. The size of the battery is one aspect, but EVs don't get used necessarily every day, like consuming the whole battery. So there are other aspects that I think come into the game in terms of playing a role in understanding the extent to which these type of instruments can respond to the needs of the electricity and transport system as a whole. So it's not like a black or white answer, but it's the best I can give.
Alex, would you like to?
So, yeah.
Maybe just a sort of very brief comment from, let's say, Global South perspective. I mean, I would definitely say that bidirectionality in EV charging would add a huge benefit to countries which have unstable grids. I mean, it would add it would increase usability of cars beyond just being a car and making a use case not in, let's say, overall grid stabilization or these sort of things, but just on the individual decision taking, and maybe not being in need on a generator which switches on occasionally when you have a power cut somewhere in the evening. So I guess if I was a manufacturer and if I was to design a vehicle for the Global South, and I believe V2G on the vehicle side is nothing crazy, then I would definitely offer that feature on all sorts of vehicles, be that a motorcycle or be that a car or be that a truck or whatsoever.
Great. And since we are talking about that, there is one last question that we can probably take, which is the unavailability of affordable EV products more of an issue in countries with high per capita car ownership? Is that something that you would like to answer to, Alex or Pierre?
Well, okay, on my end, or Alex, if you want to go first, I'm happy to go second.
No problem. I mean, I think there are different aspects to this question. Yeah? I would say from the consumer perspective, if you are purchase power constrained, then definitely a small and affordable EV is certainly something which can unlock a market. Yeah? So on the other side, country like Kenya having 50 cars per 1,000 capita compared to 550 in Europe compared to 750 per 1,000 in the US. Again, just underlining that there is most likely a pretty big growth market. And yeah, again, having appropriate products in the portfolio, I think would definitely help.
Okay, maybe to add to this, countries with high per capita car ownership have a range of different, let's say, car users. Some have high per capita income, others have low per capita income. Demand is not monolithic, it's diverse. Emerging economies where there's high per capita, low per capita income tend to have also needs that go beyond purchasing cars. Car purchases may actually happen more on like the small segment of population with high per capita income. So I'm not sure the unavailability of affordable EV products is more of an issue in high per capita income countries or not. There's also aspect related with second-hand vehicle trade. Second-hand ICE vehicles are available in emerging economies. They come from developed economies. They enable access to mobility by car at a lower price point. And we're not yet there with EVs. So there's no yet cheap EVs going from developed countries to emerging economies. We may get there. So increasing diversity of offer, I think, may also respond to the fact that we are not yet there and help having access to electric mobility, personal electric mobility in emerging economies. So I wouldn't see this as a specific issue of high per capita versus low per capita countries.
Sheila?
Yeah, I mean, just super quickly, something that no one's touched on yet is how vehicles are sold and how people access vehicles and the increasing predominance of leasing and financing deals, which are putting consumers in a whole range of markets, particularly in developed markets, into real financial difficulties. Some are even equating it to a sort of credit crunch kind of situation. So, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, we know these are the most profitable vehicles. That point was made earlier, but are the people who are pushing them digging their own kind of, you know, grave at the end of the day because people are finding them increasingly unaffordable. And in fact, legal cases are being brought about how they're being sold.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the panelists. So I think we will end the webinar here. And if there are any other questions that anyone would like to ask, please feel free to reach out to us directly on email. The recording of this webinar will be shared with all of you. We'll have the recording up on our website by early next week. And we'll also send out an email to all those who attended. And thank you so much to all the speakers and the panelists, Pierre, Jacob, Alex, Sheila. Thank you so much for coming in today. And thank you to all the participants for encouraging such insightful discussions. Have a good day, you all.
Thank you, Nick, for the moderation.